as we continue on with my reading of my book, and there's tweeting in the background. I think we're going to be constantly tweeting, not because of comments, but the bird. I think the bird is correcting me. And we have I have a little conflict here. The bird wants to tweet, and her tweets are more important than my tweets. Hiya, hiya, hiya. Okay, Radio Daze. Now, this is chapter 2 of Let a Smile Be Your Umbrella, but Don't Get a Mouthful of Rain, the told Joey Reynolds story. Now, I am told that chapter 2 is longer, and I might want to do it in 2 sittings. My life didn't go that way. I had 1 sitting, and this is a pothole, so let's go. It's a, what do they call this again? A podcast. That's what I would have done on my drug days. Radio Daze. Hiya, hiya, hiya. My on-the-air greeting in the 60s. Even though I won, however dubiously, the Announcer of the Future contest, it didn't exactly open the doors for me. You don't just go from winning a contest to being a TV full-time employee. Someone at the station advised me, they say, hey, Pinto, why don't you start out by selling time in radio? That's right, I was born Joey Pinto. I'm not going to tell you what my nickname was. To break into the media business, you have to go in little steps. And back then, we didn't have internships. We had love slaves. You hung around and it became a pain in the ass till somebody gave you a job. If you hung around long enough, they knew you were serious, and they would give you little jobs to do. People would ease you in, and that's how the game was played. One of the places I used to hang around was Buffalo radio station WBNY. BNY, Buffalo, New York. That's what it stands for. The program director, Arnie Shore, never did hire me, but he gave me some life-changing advice. One day he told me, you can't use the name Pinto, it's too ethnic. You need a white-bread, all-American household name like Reynolds Rap. Joey Reynolds, that's it. So I took my new name and went to the local top radio station that played rock and roll, although it was a renegade station because it played that kind of music. It was also the foreign language station. I was given the job of spinning the foreign language records and doing the remote broadcast for the Polish and German shows. And they let me sell ad time and keep a percentage of whatever I sold. At 15, I got my first promotion idea. I thought, let's take the afternoon franchise man, Guy King, who now goes by his original name, Dick Burton, and is the #1 morning guy in Detroit for a number of years, and let's do the show from the beach in Canada. There was a beach called, what was it, Crystal Beach. And that meant going through the Canadian government because it's their air. We didn't have the sophisticated satellite system we have now. We had only the telephone lines and what they called a MARTI unit, M-A-R-T-I, to play the transmission. I wrote a letter to the Canadian government, ipso facto. We're going to commence our broadcast on July 1 to celebrate Dominion Day and continue through July 4th, our American holiday. Our holidays are your holidays. I copied the FCC. Everybody signed off on it like it was a matter of fact. And the Canadian government signed it and sent a letter and said, yeah, okay. I began to sell time and get sponsors. We then proceeded to do the show from the beach all summer long with the blankets and a lot of girls around us. That's Dick Burton's beginning. He now has 8 daughters. Well, he's got his own crowd now. Rigging the Announcer of the Future contest should have taught me a lesson. Instead, it just turned me on to being a hardened con artist. I took a tape of a disc jockey I liked in Buffalo. His name was Jerry Stevens. And he wanted to be at WNEW New York, never made that. But I sent his tape to a little station in Cleveland, and they hired me. But when I got to Cleveland and I found out that they had conned me, the station was actually 45 miles from Cleveland, in Ashland, Ohio. I took a cab and almost went broke. Because I felt deceived, I said, you know, that's not really my tape. And they said, well, we never actually listened to it. We got even. They hired me just because they needed a warm body for $60 a week. I ended up doing the farm reports, stock market reports, the polka hour, candlelight melodies, and rock and roll shows in the afternoon. Back then, DJs used to work 8 hours and do whatever was in front of them. Stations broadcast all these different shows. They hadn't adopted single formats the way they have today. I was there about a year, during which time I started sending tapes, this time my own tapes, of me doing the top 40 music show to every station I could think of. I used my natural voice. I didn't try to have an announcer's voice. That limited my appeal because the really good stations wanted announcer types. And when the all top 40 stations emerged, they wanted the real big top 40 voice like, "Hey cousins, this is your cousin Brucey." And I didn't have either. Radio announcing was an art. I was too natural sounding. My voice wasn't cultivated. I didn't know about the WOR Announcer's Guide yet. Most announcers who are worth anything at all followed the WOR Announcer's Guide in the early days. Milton Cross with the Metropolitan Opera, Walter Winchell, Don Pardo, all these guys were very articulate. They oozed class. They used no colloquialisms and had complete command of the language. Enunciation was everything. They pronounced every consonant of Rimsky-Korsakov, and they said it like they meant it. I didn't even qualify for an entry-level announcer's job, which was given to station IDs. You're listening to WOR 710 AM New York. You had to have a certain voice for that, and I didn't. Nevertheless, someone at WAMI, WAME, WAMI in Miami, liked the tape I made in Ashland, Ohio, and they hired me. I didn't know at the time this was the guy, it was the same guy who used to own the station I hung around in Buffalo. He changed his name from Leon Vishatesky to Leon Wilson, and he didn't know I was Joey Pinto because I changed my name to Reynolds. So when we met, we looked at each other and howled. And I went on the air as Joey Pinto with Larry Kane, who was the guy who covered the Beatles from Philadelphia. We put together a news department, and I was an assistant to Larry King. Larry was a great comic. He broadcast a remote show from a booth in Wolfie's Deli on Collins Avenue in Miami. He had a character named Captain Wolfie, the Crooked Cop. He would stop people and take bribes. How unusual. Howard Cosell was a different personality altogether. When he and Chris Schenkel came down from New York to cover the Johansson-Patterson fight, I was assigned to their assistant. Howard arrived in Miami and his ego had come in on a separate plane. I had to work with him for a couple of weeks to get all the fight stuff in order. I thought the way Howard used to bark at everybody was funny. He was a tall, pushy guy who steamrolled over everyone to get whatever he wanted. I never met anyone like him. We went to the boxers' training camps. I brought the tape recorders, carried Howard's things, ran his errands, drove him around. He was very demanding, precise, and extremely professional, but a major pain in the ass. When he was leaving to go to the airport on his last day in Miami, he didn't have a flight reservation. He walked up to the Eastern counter and he says, "I'm Howard Cosell. Speaking of sports." And the agent said, "I'm sorry, we don't have any seats." "Well, bump someone," Howard barked. "I am the king of sports." The agent said he couldn't do that, so he asked for a supervisor, got pissed off at the person too, and Howard went on to United counter at United Airlines. At that time, I'm standing there holding his Vicuna coat while he's ranting and raving about how important he is. United said they put him on a standby for a flight, but that wasn't good enough for him. He wanted first class, even if it meant having to physically push someone off the plane. Finally, the airline accommodated him. They were stammering. He was stammering and screaming, and they put him on a plane. Of course, in all the frenzy, Howard left his coat behind with me. He was in such a tizzy, he forgot it. And when I got back to the station, I got a call from Howard, who was frantic when he arrived in New York, where it was 30 degrees. He said, "Joey, this is Howard. Where is my coat?" I said, "And what coat?" to make him crazy. And he said, "I have a coat. I had a Vicuna coat, and I left it in your car." I said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I never saw a coat. You never wore a coat. You were in Florida." So I further aggravated him until he was frothing at the mouth. I could just picture him. Eventually he said, "You're putting me on?" I said, "Yeah, I got it in the car." "Well, get it out of the car. It's got to be sent to me post-haste. You have to put it on the next plane to New York." I said, "Yeah, it'll have its own seat." "If you couldn't get on that plane, how's a coat going to get a seat?" So he said, "You're impossible, Joey. Is Chris Schenkel still there? Have him taken on the plane with him." When I saw Howard again a couple of years later in New York at WABC, he said, "Thanks for the coat." He was a character, boy. From there, I worked at an alphabet soup of radio stations, WPOP, WIXY, WNDR, and what hampered me in the beginning started to work for me. People responded to my natural voice and easygoing style, kids liked me because I was one of them playing their music, and I was always pulling some crap. In the early 20s, I got an offer to work at WDRC in Hartford, Connecticut. I didn't take it. Listen, they were number one in the ratings. I was on the air from 6 to 9 at night, Monday through Friday, so I took it, and it was an ideal shift. I probably played more pranks than records. The one night I was playing the Wilson Pickett in the midnight hour, and it started to skip, playing in the midnight, in the midnight, in the midnight, in the midnight. So I let it go like that for about half an hour, then 2 hours, and all that time I locked myself in the studio. Now, I had done that earlier with the Sherry by the Four Seasons at WPOP when I was there years earlier. I played the record for 4 hours. What most people didn't realize is why I got away with it before the cops busted me was because the program director was Morton Downey Jr., and he was crazier than me. Anyway, on this midnight hour thing, which was a repeat of history, kind of, on another station in the same market, the police came by because they were getting so many calls. People thought I had died or had a heart attack or something. Back in those days, people cared about their disc jockeys and the radio stations, and they were tuned into every move that we made, every contest that we gave, too, and every phone call that they could make to win them. The police broke the door down to get in. They expected something terrible, but there I was doing the show from WDRC's Tower House, which was across from a cemetery. I pictured myself going there. The cops wanted to arrest me. I put it all on the air. I had the mic on when they came in, and I could hear the cops coming in to reprimand me, and I flipped the mic on. The station got in a lot of trouble for that, but the ratings skyrocketed. With enough pranks like that one, the station became number one and made a lot of money. The owners decided to move the station downtown to a beautiful new 15-story building. WDRC was called the Big D, so they built the building in the shape of a D. But who the hell would ever know that except for a helicopter pilot, which these days nobody wants anyway. The station threw itself into a moving party. It was literally a moving party because it was a parade. At the head of the parade was Petula Clark, singing Downtown because that's where the station was moving. The DJs were all very popular, following behind her. There was Dickie Robinson, who was a teen idol, and Ron Landry, who went on to be Hudson and Landry in L.A., and also he had written Alice's Restaurant and a couple of TV shows. Everybody was a superstar. The one mistake they made with this new $1 million headquarters was that they put the bathroom on a different floor from the studio. You would think they put the toilet next to the studio, but you actually had to take an elevator. You couldn't even take the stairs because they were alarmed. So once during a commercial break, I went to the bathroom, got stuck in the elevator coming back down to the studio, so I used the elevator phone and went on the air from there when they dropped the mic down through the hole. No, that wasn't the first time I got trapped outside the studio during a show. A girl from Southern New England Telephone Company, in those days everything was Ma Bell, Snetco. I did a recorded a record called Ma Bell, You Got Me by the Calls. That was at the time when we had the fear of monopoly from the phone company. Of course, look at today, they're regrouping. They used to call me every night at the New England Telephone Company. We'd flirt with each other on the phone while the records were spinning. I was very popular with the girls. There were some, in those days, the operators were girls. I thought this one girl had a sexy voice. She liked mine, though we had never met. So one night we arranged to meet outside. Just a couple blocks down the street from the station is where the telephone company was located. So she was going to go down to the street during her 15-minute break, and I was going to run down the street during her song. I played, I think it was Bob Dylan, Life is Like a Rolling Stone, which is the longest record we had. We planned to say hello real fast and then go back to our corners. Well, I put the longest album I had. It was a Harry Belafonte record. That's the one I played. And I ran downstairs without realizing it. I had the door locked behind me. When I saw her, I shrieked because she was ugly as sin. It's a good thing the feeling was mutual. So she ran back to the phone company and probably locked herself in her room. But I couldn't get back into the station because I forgot my key. I was only in my early 20s, so these sorts of things just rolled off me. But along with resiliency, youth breeds arrogance, and I was very arrogant, and I was breeding. I would say anything on the air I wanted to. For instance, the mayor of Hartford at the time, Ann Usello, who happened to be the first female in the country, came into the station one day when I was on the air. I saw her in the hall, and I said, Ann, come on in and talk to me. She ignored me. So I knocked on the glass. I said, "Hey, Ann, come in." And she walked by me and said, I said, "She's a dumb broad." I got suspended for a month without pay. And when my month was up, I turned the mic on at 6 o'clock. I played my theme song, and I said, "This is Joey," and she's still a dumb broad. The owners let it slide this time. Oh, that record with Harry Belafonte, was it? Where did he get stuck? Was it a day-o, day-o, day-o? Didn't happen, but it's a good joke. Anyway, when I was a DJ in Hartford, the recording industry considered the city a tertiary market, third most important market. Smaller cities were test markets for new songs, so that stations in primary markets like New York and Cleveland would never have to waste time experimenting with new records. They'd play only these songs that had become hits in the test markets. The official publication that tracked record performance in test markets were on the Gavin Report. When I was in Hartford, the music director, who reported the hits directly to Bill Gavin, was Bertha Porter. She was a heavy-set woman who wore a polka-dot dress. She always seemed to have a chowder stain in the same spot and the same dress. One night she was asleep in the music library, and I took my mic, I was on the air, and I put it under her chin. Between songs, I broadcast her snores, running commentary from one of the industry's big-time music mavens. Good thing she was a sound sleeper. And didn't hear about this until after I left the station. When I was looking for a place to live in Connecticut, I looked in West Hartford, which is exclusive. I saw a quietly nestled colonial house with a little apple and pear orchard on the property. The house was built and being sold by a rich guy named Larry Weinberg. He built a replica also of the Santa Maria, one of the 3 Columbus ships, for the '64 World's Fair. And he sailed it here to this country from Europe. The novelty lasted about an hour, and so did the World's Fair. So he went bust with it and needed to sell some of his toys, but he wouldn't sell the house to me unless I agreed on one condition. I had to take his longtime maid, Lily, who had spent 30 years with his family. If anyone was more independent and arrogant than I, it was Lily. When I met with Weinberg about the house, she interviewed me as to whether I was deserving to live in her house, and then she told me her terms. "Well, Mr. Reynolds," she said, "I want the following. You'll pay me a wage of $65 a week. You pay for my dry cleaning and my car. I'll have all the food I want, and I bring it to my room, which is above the garage, my quarters, if I choose to." I said, "You'll do the laundry?" She said, "I don't do laundry." I said, "You're going to wash the floors?" "I don't do floors." "You're going to do the gardening?" "I don't do gardening. We have Bobby come in once a week, do gardening and plowing in the winter." Well, I said, "You're going to make the beds?" "No, sir." "Well, what do you do?" I asked. And she said, "I dust." Lily got my number right away, and she was going to play me for all she could. One day I bought a nice T-bone steak. Lily instructed me on which butcher to go to. We had a regular butcher, of course. I put the steak on the grill. I cooked it. Lily didn't cook either, though once in a while she'd make duck from my duck pond. When the steak was done, I put it on the counter. While I went to wash my hands, when I came back, the center of the steak was gone. The sweet meat was gone. Lily had cut the best part. The tenderloin, took it up to her room. I went upstairs, and she was sitting there with a do-rag on, eating my steak. I said, "Excuse me, that was my dinner." She said, "Well, we're family." And I said, "You're eating the best part of the steak." She said, "Well, wouldn't you want your sister to have the best part of the steak?" I said, "You're not my sister. Honey, you play the records. They say you're my brother and I'm your sister. So get over it." She also had a mysterious boyfriend. "I got to see AC." She said, "AC." I said, "Who's AC?" "He's my boyfriend." I said, "What's his name?" "Them's his name." "What do you mean them's his name?" "Them's his initials." I said, "Well, he's got to have a name." "Well, I call him AC. His name is Bob." I said, "Why do they call him AC?" She said, "Honey, I don't ask questions of AC. That's why we have a long-time friendship." "Well, what do you do with him?" I asked. "I go over on Sunday," she said. "He's my honey, and I snuggle with him, and on my day off, I make him dinner." I said, "You do more for him than you do for me." "Well, you ain't giving me dick," she said. I guess she had a point. I was hoping to meet AC, and I threw a Christmas party one year. I invited all the people from the radio station. King Curtis, He was in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He is now. Do you know him, King Curtis? He came over and with a really great singer. Toby Legend named her that name because he wanted her to be a legend, as she would have if she had stayed on recording. Lily decorated the house to a tree. She really knew how to get things done. By that, I mean she knew how to hire caterers. But AC never showed. After our dinner, I think I threw a duck back in the pond. Anyway, I hit the big time in the early 60s when I was at WKBW, back in my old hometown of Buffalo. The station had a 50,000 watt transmitter, so folks far away as Philly, Washington, D.C., and Montreal could pick us up. We actually made the ratings in some of those cities, and back then, there were fewer stations. FM hadn't opened up yet. We had a 60 or sometimes 70 share, which is unheard of today. Now a station is lucky to have a 3 share. I was a real original back in those days. I pioneered this natural voice, saying whatever is on my mind style of radio. I certainly wasn't an announcer, and I wasn't even joking, which meant hitting the cues on the records. I wasn't a jock. I was a joker, not a jocker. I was introducing records the way Dan Ingram did, always very joyfully. I wasn't always joyful. I was just me. Occasionally, I would insult the guests. After interviewing Brenda Lee, I made a little comment about her over the intro of the record. I didn't know she was listening to me on the way to the airport. But I said, Brenda Lee just left here, and she's short and has pimples. Oh, my God. And she's one of the nicest people you ever meet in your life, and a real family person. She still stays that way. Anyway, this is pretty mild by morning zoo standards, and the eventual Howard Stern and Jerry Springer and Mort Downey, of course, who extended his radio persona onto television. Maybe it was because of my popularity. It grew faster than my bank account, but it took me a while to realize the station was making a lot of money off me, but it wasn't exactly being generous with me. I didn't know how to value myself or demand pay to commensurate with my ratings, but I got a little lesson about that from Kelly Isley, one of the Isley brothers. Here's what happened. As the hottest jock in the country, which I was at the time, people often asked me to help them put concerts and tours together. One day, my friend, Fred Clistine, and cohort, who did a midday show on WKBW, whose niece went to Buffalo State Teachers College, he told me the school wanted to have a concert in its auditorium, and as a favor to him and his niece, he asked me if I'd be able to get the school a rock and roll act. The college had a limited amount of money. It was about $2,500. So, of course, I called Dick Clark because he had the tours, and those things were very expensive. We didn't have enough money for that. But I found out the Isley Brothers of Twist and Shout were in the area, and they were on a tour with the Shirelles and Ruby and the Romantics, part of the Dick Clark tours. And the Exciters, remember that with Tell Him? And an opening band. This whole tour had a night off, so I called them and asked if they'd like to do the gig. And a couple of them said, sure. So Freddie and I set it up with Buffalo State College. We got all the contracts in order. The school was real appreciative, offered me $500 to MC it. So I was happy that in addition to having some fun, I was going to make some money. At the last minute, the opening band that was traveling with the tour couldn't make it. So we came up with the $500 for a local pickup band. The auditorium was filled. And after the opening band went on, the Isley Brothers came over to me and said they were not going to go on because they needed to have half their money up front. And I said, well, we'll get it to you after the show. They said, no, you won't. We have to have it now. We don't go on without our money. We want our money in front. I said, what are you talking about? Kelly Isley pulled me aside and said, we get our money up front. And I said, this is a state school. I said, I don't think the check's going to bounce. That isn't the point. We get our money up front. We have to cash. We don't work on checks. I said, Kelly, I'll have to make a lot of changes. He said, well, then go and make the changes. They put me in a really bad spot. I said, this is the way we do it, he informed me. We don't take the money in back, we take it up front. So I said, I'd see what I could do. I went to the school representative, and he had to go wake up the bursar, and then the dean had to be bothered. They're all mad, and the kids were stomping their feet at 8 o'clock at night and impatient with the Isley Brothers, for the Isley Brothers. Finally, we got some cash, and they went on, and it was a great concert. The entire student body was rocking. After the show, when Kelly Isley and I were on the way out, I asked the dean of students where I could pick up the money. The dean said, well, Joey, we don't feel compelled to pay you. I said, why not? He pulled out the contract and said, well, you said here you'd have the Isley Brothers, the Exciteds, the Shirelles, and Ruby and the Romantics. I said, yeah, but you didn't have the opening band, Joe and the Four Shits. I said, well, it's because we used Jack and Mary Lou Sixpack. But you don't understand, he said. You didn't live up to your contract. I was dumbfounded. I said, well, that was just a pickup band. We got a band, you had a band. He said, well, legally, we don't have to give you the money. So Kelly turned to me and he said, should have got your money up front. So that's the part 1 of chapter 2 of the Let Us Smile Your Umbrella. What is it? I forgot the name of my own book. Let Us Smile Your Umbrella, but don't get a mouthful of rain. Yeah, you get old enough and you start to forget you forgot what you wrote. I have to live down to my standard now. It's a Reynolds Rap. Hiya, hiya. It's Joey Reynolds with part 2 of chapter 2. The gospel according to St. Joey. Self-appointed, of course. I was talking about the dance that I provided for with Fred Clestine, my cohort and working partner at WKVW in Buffalo. He said after I died, I was so misunderstood. He said, after you die, your grave is going to read, nobody liked him but the people. Yeah, well, that's the shock jock thing, you know. Anyway, this is part 2 of chapter 2. After that event of the fundraising for the school, I got thinking about money, and I realized I was the number 1 disc jockey in America, and the station wasn't paying me anything, maybe a few $100s a week. Plus, I had a TV show on Saturday that the station was making a lot of money from. It was sold out. My TV show was a variety program. I presented a lot of different artists, did some comedy. It wasn't a very good show, but it was successful. It got high ratings, and it sold out its 18 commercials. Anyway, I thought it was terribly underpaid and that they needed to kiss my ass and give me a lot of money, and that would make me very happy. So around this time, there was a telethon from the Variety Club. People thought that because it was a fundraising event, the stars did the telethon for free, but it didn't work that way. Frank Gorshin, who was the Riddler on Batman, was hired to come in and do the telethon. So was Forrest Tucker, had a show called F Troop. He was Sarge. I contributed enormously to the telethon on my own with my bowling money, frankly. And I think a lot of people in the audience thought that their money was going to go directly to helping the kids, the Variety Club, which it does, but not all of it. I use the airtime anyway on my radio show to promote the telethon on the beginning night of the telethon. And organizers scheduled me to appear on the telethon in the middle of the night, which I thought was a little disrespectful considering my popularity. In those days, I felt cheated and frustrated, and I used to drink. So one night after I had a few drinks, I had Frank Gorshin on the radio, and Gorshin, who was known for doing great impressions, wouldn't do any impressions for me on the air on the radio show. He says, I'm here for the Variety Club telethon, and then he went like state's witness on me. I said, well, how about a little fun? Do your impression of, let's say, Kirk Douglas. And he growled at me and he said, nah, we're raising money for the telethon. And I said, well, how about an impression of? And he said, no. And I said, you know, you're raising money, but you aren't going to do anything entertaining here. And I was aggravating him. I always liked him. I thought he was a great impressionist, but he was very adamant about not wanting to work with me. I kept pushing him, and he didn't want to be pushed, so he walked off. I made a little comment on the air. I said, well, you know he's not doing this free. They pay him to come in for the telethon, and this guy doesn't want to work on the radio because he's too important for radio. He's doing TV. Same with Forrest Tucker. They gave him 10 grand and a case of booze in his dressing room, which happened to be the truth. Well, the management went crazy when they heard that I revealed how much the guys were being paid and what the conditions were. So I said on the air, you know, there's a company out of Pittsburgh that puts these telethons together, and it makes more money than the charity. So your little donations, your bowling money goes to those guys. The vice president of Cap Cities, which is the #1 broadcast group in the country at the time, they bought ABC Television. The vice president of Cap Cities, a bald guy named Bob King, came into my studio and he said, you know, these are my friends. You insulted my friends. And I said, well, I'd be your friend too for 10 grand and a case of booze. He said, I ought to fire you. And I said, you're not my boss. He said, well, then your boss is fired. I said, why don't you fire everybody you see? You can't grow ratings any more than you could grow a hair, is what I told him. Well, he stormed out, and I knew I was through there. So after I got off the air that night, I had a few more drinks, and I went to a go-go club, and I picked up my girlfriend I was seeing. Then I showed up to do the telethon. There was a crowd waiting to see me. People were clamoring all over me. Teenagers wanted to hold on to me and have me sign autographs. After my telethon appearance, the same screaming crowd was outside. But because of the comments I made earlier on the radio, management decided to have me escorted out of the studio. So here I drew all these adoring fans, but the owners were escorting me out like a criminal. It was bizarre. I didn't need to hang around for any formal firing, so I went back to the station to get my things, and on the way out, I took off my shoes out of the dressing room, and I nailed them to the station manager's door with a note that said, "Fill these, you assholes." This part is not in the book because it hadn't happened yet, but I got friendly with Frank Gorshin years later, and he played George Burns on Broadway brilliantly. He also smoked and smoked and smoked. He was like a chimney, and he was like Morton Downey with the cigarettes, and who was another one of my best friends. So Frank Gorshin was on my show in New York, and he was on Broadway, and I said, "Frank, I apologize for all of that." And he said, "Well, Joey, I apologize too." So we made nice with each other. And I said, "What was going on?" He says, "I'm a visual act. It's not the sound of the impressions I do, but it's the look." He said, my Kirk Douglas is a look. He said, "And you're on radio and you want me to do these impressions." So I said, "Oh boy, I'm so sorry." I said, "I really was trying to push him into an area where he wasn't at his best." And we stayed good friends. He passed away a couple of years later, but I love him. He was quite a guy, and a great talent. He was a really good impressionist. Now, back onto my book. My wildest ride was probably at WXYZ in Detroit around 1966. There was never a dull moment in Detroit, at least that I remember. I lived at the DAC, the Detroit Athletic Club. My manager, Tony Mammarella, who was the producer of American Bandstand out of Philly. He had 8 kids, incidentally. He was quite a Catholic guy. He got me the first Mustang, as my manager, got me the first Mustang metal flake paint job Ford. They made about 25 of them for display in airports, and I saw one in the Detroit airport, and he thought I should be a real local hero driving around in Motown's prize car. So I did. I had the freedom on the radio, meanwhile, to play whatever I wanted to on the air, and I played a record. If I did, it became a hit. I had a good program director with Lee Allen. He was the guy who hired me out of Cleveland. I also had a lot of freedom off the air, too. Much freedom, too much. I drank a lot of scotch, smoked a lot of pot, screwed a lot of girls. I went drinking every night. When I got off the air, I wound up in strange beds in strange places like a boat on the Detroit River. I'd wake up in the morning and forget where I was and how I got there. It was the beginning of my alcohol addiction, as I recall. Although I was drinking earlier, but this is when it really kicked in. For some reasons, I have no doubt blocked this out. But I wound up after the WXYZ job at WIBG in Philly, which is the home of my producer and my great manager, the only manager I ever had in my life. That was Tony Mammarella. So in the late 60s, WIBG was the #1 station in Philly. It used to stand for WIBG, I Believe in God. When I got there, I thought it was I Believe in Greenbacks. The politics were staggering. I went out with the afternoon guy who told me to avoid the morning guy. I went out with High Lit, who said, "Whatever you do, stay away from Joe Niagara." I went out with Joe Niagara. He said, "High Lit's treacherous. Watch out for George Wright." Everybody was cutthroat. That's because everybody was a star. WIBG was one of the few personality stations in the country where the DJs had a helicopter to get them to record hops. There were a lot of events to go to because Philly's rock culture was awesome. And it was solid, stone solid, for being on the cutting edge of music, though the city was locked in a time tunnel. So when I landed in Philly on American Airlines flight, I grabbed the stewardess microphone and said, "Welcome to Philly. Set your watches back 100 years. It's one of those cities where nothing changes, and I think they're still making those cheesecakes from the same calf." Calf. People in the entertainment industry don't like to leave the city. They go away, they make their movie or record, then they always come back. A lot of recording stars at the time, like Frankie Avalon and Fabian, became movie stars. They came from South Philly. But I was always a wise ass. I said the best thing to come out of South Philly was the northbound train. It did not endear me to the locals. But that didn't matter. I was uniquely positioned to have my friends fly in from out of town. The house I had outside of Philly in Bluebell was right next to Wings Field, had its own landing strip, 10 acres. The manager of the station I worked at in Hartford, Dick Corson, used to land his plane in my backyard. So I did, who else was there? Frank Kingston Smith. He did too. He was a radio guy. His father was the president of the American Pilots Association. Frank came in on his plane and would take me on short trips to Atlantic City, for instance, and a lot of recording stars would come to my house and party. Minnie Ripperton, then with the Rotary connection, came from Chicago. Wolfman Jack came to visit. We became good friends. He was totally whacked. We would all smoke pot around this big roaring fireplace in the den, and it seemed always I had a kettle of lobsters on it, thanks to my friend Charlie Roberts. I led a pretty decadent life, partying and bellowing at the moon. But for a wild guy, I had a gentleman's farm. Lily, who was my maid in Hartford, she came with the house in Hartford. She moved into Philly, didn't like it at all. A herd of animals came in from with the house in Philly. It started with a horse, and then Johnny Bond, who was a baseball Hall of Famer, promotion man for records, and a friend of Roberto Clemente, he gave me a Great Dane. Then someone gave me some chickens. They would sleep in the trees, and when they laid eggs, the eggs would fall and splatter on the ground, so that was dumb. I couldn't get them to roost in the garage, so I let them roam free. Nick Virtue gave me a pet pig, which grew from 20 to 400 pounds. That's when I referred to WFIL as Whiffle the pig. Then the incident occurred. The Great Dane attacked the pig. I called the vet and said the pig is bleeding profusely from the ear. He told me if the pig is still alive, she's smarter than the dog. I said, you're kidding. He said, no, Great Danes are inherited wild boar hunters. He said, hold the pig on your lap, give her a cold compress, and talk gently to her. I said, I don't want to sleep with her. I just want to stop the bleeding. He said, well, that's what you do. So I did, and of course she became a part of the family. She was smart and gentle and knew how to make it on the paper. Yes, you can potty train a pig. Eventually I had to slaughter her, but I couldn't eat the meat. I'd look at it wistfully in the refrigerator, and through the pork chops, it brought a tear to my eye. I somehow managed to work my way through the bacon, though. That was smoked. Learning to love all these animals must have gotten into my genes. My daughter Kristen's going to study marine biology at that time. Mercedes wanted to be a zoologist. They both ride horses. Mercedes had a cockatiel, which she won't put in the cage. Sound familiar? 2 dachshunds, hamsters, and a turtle. The gentleman farmer now lives in a petting zoo. Now, Rats in My Room is on page 57 here. I'm not talking about the hit novelty song fellow Danny Neverett and I recorded when we were at WKBW in the early 60s. I'm talking about record company rats. Over the years, I've been quoted as saying both that I took payola and I didn't take payola, so I want to clear that up. When record company guys offered to take me out to lavish dinners or provide a star for a record hop or send me to a concert or give me cigars, steaks, or booze, or later on drugs, I accepted those gifts, but I never took cash. Giving gifts and going on junkets, those things are still going on today, only it's usually the program directors and the people who own the stations, not those who are being schmoozed. This sort of thing happens in every business, not to mention politics. It's called lobbying. But that doesn't mean I was never offered cash. When I was in Hartford, Connecticut, at WPOP before I hit the big time, I was pretty naive. There was a record company guy who used to come to the studio while I was on the air and bring me the company's latest records with him. If I liked it, I played it. Once he gave me a record I liked so much I played it twice. While it was spinning, he asked me for a cigarette. I handed him my pack of Salems. We talked about having lunch sometime, and on his way out, he left me a couple of copies of the record. Later, I went to get a cigarette, and there was a roll of money in the pack. I was nervous, and no one had given me cash like that. I went to the general manager of the station, explained what happened, gave him the cigarette pack with the money in it. He said he would take care of it. It dawned on me later that the station manager probably just took the money himself and never said anything to the record guy. I think that's why record people still like and respect me, because they know I'm an honorable person. I never had my hand out back in those days. I still don't. These days, being in talk radio, I don't get offered much. You know what they say? They say talk is cheap. So that's chapter 2. We'll be back with chapter 3 as soon as I read it. I have to read my own story. I've had a very interesting life. I think I would like to be that guy. Wait a minute. I am. It's a Reynolds Wrap.